When the hostess at the Marlowe Club led Maren Vale to the private booth beneath the amber glass chandelier, she expected to find the kind of man her Aunt Rosalind usually approved of, someone polished, useful, and properly expensive. Instead, the man waiting for her had a little girl beside him, a weathered canvas jacket folded over one arm of the booth, and hands so rough they looked as if they had spent the afternoon arguing with engines, lumber, and winter itself. The child was coloring on the back of a paper menu with a blue crayon, her small brow pinched in concentration, while the man carefully tore a bread roll in half and placed the larger piece on her plate. Maren stopped 3 feet from the table, her silver heels quiet on the thick carpet, and for the first time in weeks, no one around her spoke. The room itself seemed to notice the insult of it. She was 34 years old, founder and controlling owner of Vale Aerodyne Systems, a defense technology empire valued higher than most small nations, and she had just been maneuvered into dinner with a man who looked as though he should have been parking trucks behind the building, not sitting inside a dining room where the cheapest bottle of wine cost more than a mortgage payment. The man rose at once. He was tall, broad, without trying to show it, with tired green-gray eyes and dark hair cut short at the sides. "Maren," he said, offering his hand with an awkward gentleness that somehow irritated her more than arrogance would have. "I'm Callum Reed. Rosalind has told me a lot about you." Maren looked at his hand, at the thin white scars crossing his knuckles, at the faint black half-moons under his nails, then gave it the smallest possible shake. "She failed to mention you were bringing a child." The little girl looked up from her drawing, her crayon pausing above a crooked blue bird. "I'm Junie," she said softly. Callum's jaw tightened for half a second, not in anger, but in restraint. "My neighbor who watches her had a fall this afternoon. I tried to call Rosalind, but she was already in a charity board meeting. I didn't want to cancel at the last minute and waste your evening." "How thoughtful," Maren replied, sitting down as if the chair had offended her. "You preserved my evening by turning it into a family obligation." Callum slowly lowered himself back into the booth, keeping one arm near his daughter, and said, "I'm sorry. She'll be quiet." "That was not my concern." Maren opened the wine list without looking at him. "I don't dislike children. I simply dislike surprises, especially when I have been assured that I am meeting a grown man for dinner." The words landed hard enough that Callum's expression changed, but Junie only lowered her head and returned to her drawing, coloring the bird's wing darker than before. Maren had not wanted to be there in the first place. Rosalind, her mother's older sister, and the only relative who could still speak to her without being escorted out by security, had spent months insisting that Maren's life had become a museum exhibit, immaculate, impressive, and cold enough to preserve the dead. Maren had laughed when she said it, then returned to a merger call. The truth was that Maren liked cold things. Cold glass, cold numbers, cold contracts. Cold rooms where no one raised their voice because everyone understood the consequences. Warmth had never served her well. Warmth had been her father promising to come home from business trips and forgetting. Warmth had been her mother making excuses until illness took her voice. Warmth had been men smiling at charity galas while calculating how much of Vale Aerodyne they could reach by touching her hand. Cold was honest. Cold kept ledgers. Cold won. Callum Reed, with his thrift store jacket and his daughter's crayon tucked behind one ear, was not cold. That alone made him suspect. The waiter arrived, and Maren ordered a glass of Sancerre without asking whether Callum wanted anything. Callum ordered iced tea and a bowl of tomato soup for Junie, then smiled apologetically when the waiter hesitated, as if soup in that room required committee approval. Maren watched the exchange with a faint, humorless curve of her mouth. "Rosalind said you owned a business," she said. "I do," Callum answered. Reed and hollow, mostly restoration work, weatherproofing, off-grid systems, cabins, old barns, storm shelters, some custom mechanical repair. So, construction. Some of it. A blue-collar contractor, she said, as though translating him into a lower language. Why didn't she simply say that? Callum folded his napkin across his lap, his movements slow and deliberate. Maybe she thought you'd ask what I built before deciding what I was worth. Maren finally looked fully at him. There was no challenge in his face, only steadiness, and somehow that made her sharpen. I know what people are worth, Mr. Reed. I employ 12,000 of them. I sign more payroll in 1 month than most companies generate in a year. Worth is not mysterious. It appears on balance sheets. Junie looked at her father, confused by the tone, if not the meaning. Callum rested a hand lightly over the child's crayon-smudged fingers and said, "Eat your soup when it comes, Bug." Maren caught the nickname and nearly smiled, but stopped herself. Sentiment, in public, was almost always manipulation. Dinner unraveled with quiet brutality. Callum tried, more than once, to speak kindly. He asked Maren about the new research campus her company had opened outside Bethesda, and she gave him a clipped answer meant to end the subject. He mentioned that he had grown up in northern Michigan, learned carpentry from his grandfather, and moved to Philadelphia after his wife died because a friend had offered him partnership in a small restoration shop. Maren heard the dead wife and chose not to soften. "A tragic backstory does not make a person interesting," she said after he briefly explained that Junie's mother had been a nurse. Callum did not respond at once. He only reached for his water glass, took a sip, and looked down as if placing his anger somewhere his daughter would not trip over it. Maren noticed him using the wrong knife for the fish course and set her fork down with a light click. "You are uncomfortable here." "A little," he admitted. "I'm more of a diner person." "That much is clear." She nodded toward his hands. "You know this restaurant has washrooms." Callum glanced down. There was a dark stain near the edge of his thumb, probably grease or old sealant, caught deep in skin that had been cleaned but not softened. "I scrubbed," he said quietly. "Some work stays with you. So does poverty, apparently." The silence that followed was small but complete. Even the waiter, returning with Junie's soup, seemed to slow. Callum looked at Maren with a kind of sadness that irritated her, because it suggested he saw something in her she had not given him permission to see. "That was unnecessary," he said. "Most true things are," she replied. Junie's lower lip trembled, though she tried to hide it behind a spoonful of soup. Callum turned to his daughter and murmured, "It's all right." Then, to Maren, he said, "Rosalind told me you were direct. She didn't say you were cruel." Maren lifted her wine. Cruelty is what people call accuracy when they cannot afford to answer it. She stood before the main course was cleared. "This has been enlightening, Mr. Reed. You are probably a decent man in the correct setting. This is not it. We should both be grateful for clarity." Callum rose because he had manners, not because she deserved them. Junie slid from the booth and held her drawing against her chest. It showed a blue bird, a small house, and 3 stick figures under a crooked sun. "I made it for you," she whispered. Maren did not take it. She looked at Callum instead. "Rosalind can pay for whatever emotional lesson she thought this was. I'll cover the bill." Callum's face changed then. Not with humiliation exactly, but with the tired dignity of a man who had been judged by lesser people before and survived it. "Keep your money," he said softly. "Junie and I can pay for our soup." Maren gave a cold laugh. Pride is expensive for men in work boots. He did not flinch. He only picked up his daughter's coat, helped her into it, and said, "No, Miss Vale." Pride is what's left when people mistake your clothes for your character. For one thin second, something in his voice found its way past the locks she kept inside herself. Then Maren turned away, walked through the club's paneled doors, and let the night air erase him. By morning, she had filed Callum Reed under inconvenience and moved on. 4 days later, Maren was flying through low clouds toward the Allegheny Mountains with 6 executives, 2 foreign partners, a legal team, and enough armed security to make the helicopter feel less like transport than warning. The deal waiting at the end of the trip was the largest of her career, a strategic acquisition of Helix Meridian, a European satellite navigation firm whose encryption patents would give Vale Aerodyne an unmatched hold over civilian and military guidance systems. The negotiations had become too sensitive for city hotels and too tempting for corporate spies, so Maren had leased Iron Pine Reserve, a private mountain estate in western Pennsylvania once owned by a coal baron, and recently transformed into a luxury retreat for people who wanted wilderness without discomfort. It sat above a frozen gorge behind 2 locked gates, a private access road, and 14 miles of dense hemlock forest. Cell service was unreliable by design. The lodge had encrypted satellite uplinks, independent power, and a staff trained to disappear. Maren liked the place immediately. Its walls were glass, stone, and old timber beams. Its fireplaces were large enough to roast secrets, and its conference room looked east over a valley sealed in snow. While her executives admired the view, Maren checked her tablet and corrected a clause that would have cost her voting control in one subsidiary. She had no patience for awe. Nature was simply another asset when fenced, heated, and insured. Her head of security, Pierce Danton, met her near the main entrance. He was thick-necked, expensive, and humorless, a former private security consultant whose references used phrases like field-tested and mission-capable. Maren paid him not to be pleasant. "Perimeter is clean," he said. "Local service crew is finishing generator checks. They'll be gone before the first session." "Good," Maren said. "I don't want strangers wandering around when Helix arrives." Pierce glanced toward the far end of the great room. "There's one contractor still inside. Claims the storm shutters on the west dormer are jammed." Maren followed his gaze and stopped so abruptly that the assistant behind her nearly walked into her. On a ladder near the fireplace, sleeves rolled to the forearms, a man was tightening a steel bracket against a beam. His canvas jacket hung over a chair. The same scarred hands held a ratchet. The same stillness settled around him when he looked down and saw her. Callum Reed descended the ladder slowly. "Miss Vale." "Absolutely not," she said. Pierce stepped forward, already pleased to have someone to intimidate. "Problem?" Maren stared at Callum as if he had been planted there by a malicious universe. "What are you doing on my property?" "It isn't your property," Callum said evenly. "Not beyond the lease period. My company maintains the reserve's storm systems and old mechanical structures. The west dormer was taking wind. I was asked to secure it." "You were asked by whom?" "The property manager." "Then the property manager can ask someone else." "I would, except the weather has already turned on the ridge, and the lower road is glazing over. If that dormer tears loose tonight, the pressure change could take out half this room's glass. You have a lot of people sleeping under it." Maren folded her arms. She was wearing a charcoal cashmere coat, narrow black trousers, and the expression that had made venture capitalists stammer. "How noble? How long?" 40 minutes for the dormer. Then I need to check the backup generator in the pump house. After that, Junie and I will stay in the caretaker's cottage until the road clears." "Your daughter is here?" The question came out colder than the wind scraping the windows. Callum looked toward the side hall, where Junie sat on a bench with a paperback book and a paper cup of cocoa, her legs swinging above the floor. "School closed early for weather. She has headphones. She won't bother anyone." Maren felt something like embarrassment and disliked it immediately. This is a confidential corporate retreat. She's 7, not a Russian listening post. One of Maren's attorneys coughed into his hand. Pierce's mouth twitched. Maren did not look away from Callum. Finish your work and keep yourself out of sight. If you or your child come near the conference wing, Pierce will escort you down the mountain whether the road is icy or not. Callum's eyes moved briefly to Pierce, measuring him with a calm so subtle Maren almost missed it. Pierce stepped closer, trying to fill the space with his body. You hear her, tool belt? Callum picked up his ratchet and slipped it into his bag. I hear everybody. Then he looked back at Maren. You might ask your people to keep the south fire doors unlatched. Fancy locks don't help much in a power loss. I did not request advice. No, he said, lifting the ladder with one hand. You rarely do. He walked away without hurry, Junie hopping down to follow him. The child looked once at Maren, recognized her, and tucked her drawing book against her coat as if protecting it. The first day of negotiations proceeded with the usual choreography of power. Maren played gracious host until Grace became inefficient, then sharpened the room with a few well-placed questions. The Helix executives, pale from travel and too impressed by the lodge to hide it, pushed for board seats. Maren smiled and removed them from the offer without raising her voice. By evening, snow had swallowed the road, and the lodge glowed like a lantern against the black forest. Inside, chefs prepared venison, truffled potatoes, and little desserts arranged like architecture. Outside, wind struck the glass in violent gusts that made even the Europeans pause between signatures. Maren stood near the conference room window with a glass of mineral water and watched the forest vanish in white. Somewhere beyond the lodge, Callum Reed was likely crouched beside a generator or shoveling snow from a vent, earning by the hour what she spent on a lunch meeting. She told herself the thought came from irritation, but it returned twice more before dinner ended. At 8:30, Junie appeared at the edge of the great room holding a small flashlight, her hair loose from its braid. Maren noticed her before Pierce did. You're not supposed to be here, Maren said. The child froze. The cottage heater made a loud noise, Junie whispered. Daddy said to stay inside, but then he went to check something, and the lights blinked. I got scared. Maren's first instinct was to summon someone else. Instead, perhaps because several executives were watching, she walked over and took the flashlight from Junie's shaking hand. Where is your father? By the pump house, I think. Pierce muttered. I'll send a man. Do that, Maren said. Then, to Junie, after an uncomfortable pause, sit near the fireplace until he comes back. Don't touch anything. Junie obeyed, climbing into a leather chair too large for her. A few minutes later, Callum entered through the side mudroom with snow on his shoulders and a flashlight in his mouth. He crossed directly to Junie, dropped to one knee, and took her face gently between his hands. You okay, Bug? She nodded and clung to him. He closed his eyes for 1 second, relief passing over his face like pain. Maren looked away, annoyed by the intimacy of it, then more annoyed that she had been touched by it. Callum stood with Junie under one arm. The caretaker heater cracked a fuel line. I shut it down. We'll sleep in the equipment room if the manager approves. You'll sleep wherever the staff puts you, Pierce snapped. Callum did not answer him. He looked at Maren. Your west satellite mast is cycling strangely. Could be ice, could be interference. Your security team should run a manual check. Pierce laughed. Appreciate the wisdom, Bob the Builder. Callum's face stayed calm. It wasn't wisdom. It was information. Maren, tired of the exchange, said, Pierce has the perimeter. Then I hope Pierce is better at listening to machines than people. This time, Pierce took a step toward him, but Junie's small hand tightened in Callum's shirt, and Callum simply shifted his body between the guard and the child. Maren saw it. She saw, too, that Callum had not moved like a frightened laborer. He had moved like a door closing. At 11:17 that night, Iron Pine Reserve lost power. The chandeliers blinked once, twice, then died. The great room fell into a darkness so sudden that conversation broke apart into gasps and shuffling chairs. Emergency strips glowed along the floor for 3 seconds before they failed too, leaving only the firelight and the white blur of snow beyond the windows. Maren stood at the head of the conference table, irritated before she was afraid. "Pierce," she said. "Generators, now." Pierce had already lifted his radio. "North Gate, report." Static answered. He frowned. "Northgate, this is Danton. Status." Nothing. Maren felt the room change. Executives sensed danger the way animals sensed pressure before storms, and all at once the luxurious lodge seemed less fortified than exposed. Too much glass, too many shadows, too much wilderness pressing its face to the walls. "Lock the conference room," Maren ordered. Pierce drew his sidearm. "Everyone down." Before anyone could obey, the front windows shattered inward in a storm of glass. 3 black cylinders bounced across the stone floor, hissing smoke. Someone screamed. Firelight turned the room into a nightmare of silhouettes. Men in white winter camouflage breached from the terrace and service hall at the same time, moving with rehearsed precision, rifles tucked tight, lasers cutting green lines through smoke. Pierce fired twice. A suppressed burst answered, punching him backward against the conference table. He hit the floor without a sound. Maren did not scream, not at first. She stood frozen, watching men she had paid to prevent exactly this collapse in seconds, their radios dead, their weapons useless, their confidence erased. A tall woman stepped through the broken window, wearing a white parka trimmed in black, and a narrow smile that belonged in a courtroom, not a massacre. Anika Voss, CEO of Meridian Vector, Maren's fiercest competitor and the woman whose stock would become rubble once the Helix deal closed, brushed glass from her sleeve. "Maren," she said warmly, "I'm afraid your acquisition has created an urgent governance concern." "You staged an armed assault over a merger?" Maren said, forcing contempt into her voice because fear would not come when called. "No," Anika replied. "I staged a correction. The merger documents, encryption keys, and emergency voting proxies will transfer to a trust I control. You will authorize it. Then you and several witnesses will tragically disappear in a weather event before federal responders can climb this charming mountain." Maren's attorneys huddled under the table. The Helix chairman crossed himself. Anika nodded to 2 mercenaries. "Bring her. Keep the others alive until I confirm the codes." Hands seized Maren's arms. She fought, not elegantly, not effectively, but with the fury of a woman unused to being touched without permission. Someone struck her across the cheek hard enough to bring blood to her mouth. Her knees weakened. Her power, her wealth, her reputation, every controlled weapon she had ever used in conference rooms and federal hearings, dissolved in the grip of a stranger dragging her across broken glass. They pulled her outside through the ruined terrace doors, and the cold hit like a punishment. Snow whipped sideways so violently she could barely see the dark line of trees. The mercenaries half carried her toward the service road, where the faint shapes of snowmobiles waited beneath camo tarps. Her coat was gone. Her blouse clung to her skin. One of the men cursed into his radio, saying the locator signal had jumped and the satellite mast was down. Another answered that the contractor and kid had not been found in the staff wing. Maren heard the words through panic and understood only pieces. Contractor, kid, not found. Then the man on her left stopped. His fingers loosened from her arm. Maren turned just in time to see him tilt forward as if listening to the snow, then collapse, face first. A steel awl, the kind used for heavy leather and cable work, protruded from the gap beneath his helmet. The other man swung his rifle up, but the dark beside the pump house came alive. Callum Reed emerged from the storm with no wasted motion. He drove one shoulder into the rifleman's ribs, forced the barrel skyward as it fired into the night, and struck the man's throat with the heel of his hand. The rifleman staggered. Callum caught his wrist, turned under the arm, and broke something with a sound Maren felt in her teeth. The man went down. Callum took the weapon, stripped the magazine, checked it by touch, then pulled Maren behind a stack of frozen firewood as bullets snapped through the air where she had been standing. He wore a dark wool cap, his canvas jacket, and the same faded shirt she had mocked. But nothing about him seemed ordinary now. His eyes had emptied of all embarrassment and filled with calculation. "Are you wounded?" he asked. "No, I don't." "Callum, what? Can you run?" "My people are inside. Your people are alive because Annika needs leverage. You are the objective." He shoved a heavy work coat around her shoulders. "Junie is hidden in the old spring cellar with the cook and 2 staff. She's safe unless these men start searching lower structures, so we move them away." Maren stared at him. "You left your daughter?" Something flashed in his face then, sharp and terrible. "I hid my daughter so I could keep all of you breathing. Do exactly what I say." He pulled the fallen man's sidearm from a holster, tucked it into his waistband, and gripped Maren's elbow. "Step where I step. Stay low. If I tell you to drop, you drop hard. The woods are the only place where their numbers mean less. You're a contractor. Tonight I'm the man between you and a grave." He looked once toward the lodge, where smoke curled through shattered glass. "Move." The forest swallowed them within 30 seconds. Maren had known darkness from penthouse bedrooms and unlit conference rooms, but mountain darkness was different. It breathed, it shifted, it had weight in branches and hollows where death could stand still and wait. Callum moved through it as if some old map had been carved into his bones. He kept one hand on her when the slope steepened, released her only to drag pine boughs across their tracks, then guided her through a frozen creek bed where the water soaked her expensive slacks to the knee. She wanted to curse him. She wanted to demand a helicopter, an armed response, a working phone, a return to the known world. Instead, all she could do was breathe in broken white clouds and follow the dark shape ahead of her. Twice, she fell. The first time, Callum lifted her before she could fully hit the ground. The second time, she landed hard on one knee and cried out. He dropped beside her instantly, hand over her mouth, not cruelly, but completely. Voices passed above them on the ridge. Flashlights moved through the trees like pale blades. "Tracks went east," a man said. "Thermal's messy in the storm." Another voice answered, "Voss wants Vale alive. Reed optional." Callum's eyes narrowed at the mention of his name. Maren's heart hammered so loudly she was sure the men would hear it. Callum leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "When they pass, crawl backward into the creek. Slow, no splashing." She obeyed because there was no room left for pride. They slid into water so cold it stole the air from her lungs. Callum pulled a fallen branch across them, covering her with pine needles and ice. The 2 mercenaries came down the slope within 15 feet. One paused, scanning. Maren could see the dark outline of his rifle, the fog of his breath, the patch on his sleeve. Her muscles convulsed from cold. Callum's arm tightened around her from behind, holding her still. In that horrifying silence, she noticed that his hand, the hand she had mocked as dirty, was bleeding from the knuckles and steady as stone. A radio crackled. "Signal reacquired north-northeast. Move!" The men turned away. Callum waited another 10 seconds, then pulled her from the creek and hauled her up the bank. Maren stumbled against him, shaking violently. "Signal?" she whispered. "Do you have a tracker on you?" "No." Then she remembered the slim platinum bracelet under her cuff, a Vale Aerodyne executive security device tied to her pulse, location, and emergency authority. It had been designed for kidnappings, shareholder threats, and foreign travel. It had been praised by consultants, insured by lawyers, and tested in simulations run by men who had never crawled through a frozen creek while hunted by rifles. She tore at her sleeve. "My bracelet! It broadcasts on a private encrypted band." Callum's face hardened. "Can it be hacked?" "By Anika?" "Yes." He took her wrist. The bracelet would not unclasp. The biometric lock had sealed after detecting trauma. Callum pulled a compact bolt cutter from his belt. "This will hurt. Do it." He wedged the cutter under the bracelet and snapped down. The metal bit into her skin before giving way. She gasped as blood welled around her wrist. Callum threw the bracelet deep into the creek, then packed snow against the cut. "They'll follow the signal downstream until they realize." "How long?" "Not long enough." He stood, listening. "There's an old fire lookout above the North Ridge. The road washed out years ago. If we reach it, there's a hardline emergency radio in a steel box, assuming vandals didn't strip it. We can call state police, maybe the guard." "How far?" 3 miles uphill." Maren almost laughed. It came out like a sob. "I can't make 3 miles." Callum looked at her then, really looked, and the hard command in him softened without disappearing. "You can make the next 20 steps, then the next 20 after that. That's all survival is when it stops being dramatic." She wanted to hate him for saying it so calmly. Instead, she nodded. They climbed. Time became meaningless, measured only by pain, breath, snow, and Callum's hand appearing whenever the world tilted too steeply. Maren's mind, which had handled hostile takeovers and Senate testimony without trembling, began to fracture under the simple animal facts of cold and exhaustion. Her feet went numb, then burned, then seemed to belong to someone else. Branches scratched her face. Her wet pants stiffened in the wind. Once, she slipped and slid 10 feet down a slope before Callum caught her by the back of the coat and slammed his own shoulder into a tree to stop them both. He made no complaint, though she heard him exhale through clenched teeth. "Why are you doing this?" she asked when they crouched behind a boulder to catch breath. "Because it needs doing. That isn't an answer. It's the only one that matters right now. I humiliated you." Her voice broke on the word, less from guilt than from finally hearing it honestly. "At dinner, in front of your daughter." "Yes, and you still came after me." Callum looked out through the trees, watching the lower forest for movement. Snow collected on his eyelashes and melted. "Junie asked me that night why the pretty lady was so angry. I told her some people get lonely and call it strength because it sounds better." The word struck Maren harder than the cold. "You had no right to say that." "Probably not." He glanced at her. "Was I wrong?" She looked away. The answer was buried under years of contracts and polished floors, but it moved. "My mother used to say kindness was the one currency nobody could steal. My father proved her wrong. He spent hers until she had nothing left." Callum's expression did not change much, but his voice gentled. "So you decided no one would spend yours." "I decided I would never need anyone enough to be disappointed." "That works," he said quietly. "Right up until you're bleeding in the snow." She swallowed. "What were you before all this?" Callum's hand tightened briefly around the rifle. "A medic." "Military?" "Air Force Special Warfare, Pararescue, later attached to Joint Recovery Teams." Maren stared. You rescued downed pilots? Pilots, aid workers, soldiers, kids caught in places they never should have been, whoever was breathing. He spoke without pride, as if naming a former address. I did 12 years. Then my wife, Lena, got sick while I was deployed. Ovarian cancer. By the time I got home for good, she had more courage than body left. I knew how to intubate a man under gunfire and keep him alive in a helicopter with half the instruments screaming. I could not keep my own wife from dying in a hospice bed while our little girl slept in the next room. His mouth tightened. After the funeral, I put my uniforms in a trunk. Junie needed a father more than the government needed another tired rescuer, so I fix roofs, build storm shelters, repair generators, and make sure I'm there when she wakes up. Maren could not speak. The man she had dismissed as unambitious had walked away from medals because his child needed pancakes before school and someone to braid her hair badly but faithfully. Her own life, so enormous on paper, seemed suddenly narrow. "Callum," she whispered. "I'm sorry." He did not look at her. "Stay alive first. Be sorry later." They were halfway up the ridge when the forest exploded with light. A flare rose from somewhere below, hissing red against the storm, and the trees leapt into harsh relief. Bullets tore into the trunk beside Callum's head. He shoved Maren behind a fallen log and returned fire in 3 measured shots. A man cried out below. Another burst chewed through bark and snow. Callum dropped flat, rolled, and pulled Maren with him into a shallow hollow beneath the roots of an overturned hemlock. They split teams, he said. One followed the bracelet. One guessed high ground. How many? Enough. He took a small metal object from his pocket, one of his worksite chalk line reels, tied the line to a branch, and stretched it low across a narrow gap between rocks. Then he removed 2 flare cartridges from the captured vest, wedged them under a rotten log, and angled the rifle toward the slope. Maren watched his hands work with terrifying calm. "You've done this before." "Improvised under pressure?" "Killed people." He paused. The storm moved around them. "I have stopped people from killing the helpless. Sometimes they lived afterward. Sometimes they didn't." He looked at her, and she saw no romance in his answer, no thrill, no secret hunger for violence. Only cost. Do not make entertainment out of what decent people pray never happens. Shame warmed her face even in the cold. "I didn't mean—" "I know." He pulled her farther into the hollow. "Cover your ears." Footsteps approached. A mercenary moved between the rocks, rifle raised, thermal sight angled toward their hiding place. His boot caught the chalk line. The flare cartridges ignited with a violent white burst, blinding him. Callum rose from the hollow and struck him with the rifle stock before the man could fire. Another attacker rushed from the side. Maren saw him before Callum did. She did not think. She grabbed a fist-sized stone and threw it with all the panic in her body. It hit the man's cheekbone, not hard enough to drop him, but enough to turn his aim. Callum fired once. The man fell backward into the snow. Silence followed, except for Maren's own horrified breathing. She looked at the body, then at her hands. Callum stepped in front of her, blocking the view. "Look at me. I helped kill him. You helped keep us alive. That isn't better." "No," he said softly. "It's only true." He took the stone from her fingers and let it fall. "Keep moving." Something had shifted between them, not trust exactly, but a raw, unwilling recognition. Maren no longer saw Callum as a mystery wrapped in flannel. She saw a father carrying old grief and fresh danger in the same body, making room for fear, but not letting it drive. And Callum perhaps no longer saw only the woman who had laughed at his hands. He saw someone stripped of insulation, proud and frightened and trying at last to follow. The fire lookout appeared near 2 in the morning, a black skeletal tower rising above the trees with its cabin leaning slightly against the wind. The wooden stairs were glazed with ice, several broken outright. The little structure at the top looked abandoned enough to have been forgotten by the county, the state, and God. Maren leaned against the first support post, nearly sobbing from relief. There. Radio. Callum did not move toward the stairs. He was looking at the snow beneath the tower. No. What? Fresh prints. He crouched, touched one indentation, and lifted his fingers. Someone beat us here. The door of the lookout cabin above them creaked open. A voice called down, Mr. Reed, Miss Vale, you've made admirable time. Annika Voss stepped onto the tiny platform with a pistol in one hand and Junie Reed held tight against her with the other. The child's mouth was taped. Her eyes were wide, wet, and fixed on her father. Maren felt the world tilt. Callum went utterly still. It was the first time that night she saw true fear enter him, and it did not shake his hands or raise his voice. It made him quiet in a way that broke her heart. Let her go, he said. Of course, Annika replied. Once Maren authorizes the transfer package and you place your weapons on the ground. Callum slowly lowered the rifle. How did you find her? Your daughter was very well hidden. Unfortunately, one of the kitchen staff preferred his own survival to yours. People usually do. Annika smiled down at Maren. You see, Maren, that is why sentiment is a structural weakness. You and I built companies because we understood leverage. Mr. Reed here built a life around one small human being. Now that life has a handle. Junie whimpered behind the tape. Callum's face turned pale beneath the weather. Annika, Maren said, stepping forward. This is between us. It became larger than us when you tried to swallow Helix and lock every guidance patent I need behind your boardroom throne. You won't survive this legally. I don't need to survive it publicly. By dawn, there will be a wrecked lodge, dead witnesses, a missing CEO, and a digital transfer executed under your emergency authority. Corporate history is written by whoever controls the records. She pressed the pistol closer to Junie's temple. Mr. Reed, weapon down. Sidearm 2, knife, anything else. Do not make me prove I'm serious. Callum obeyed, rifle in the snow, pistol, folding knife, a small screwdriver, a coil of wire. He moved slowly, each motion controlled by the barrel against his daughter's head. Maren watched him empty himself of defenses and understood with sick clarity that this was what love looked like when it had no strategy left. It surrendered pride first. It surrendered safety second. It did not surrender the child. Now, Annika said, Maren climbs the stairs. You remain below. If he moves, Junie dies. Maren looked at Callum. His eyes met hers, and in them she read both agony and instruction. Watch. Think. Do not waste the chance. Maren climbed. Every frozen step groaned beneath her. The wind at the top shoved her sideways, and she gripped the rail with her bleeding wrist. Inside the lookout cabin, the emergency radio had been smashed. A satellite terminal sat open on a crate, its screen glowing blue. One of Anika's wounded mercenaries leaned against the wall, rifle trained on the stairs. Junie stood rigid beside Annika, tears freezing on her cheeks. Enter your executive credentials, Annika said. Then voice authorization. You will transfer operational control of 3 Helix patent entities, emergency voting proxies, and the Vale Aerodyne escrow keys to a trust whose documents I have already prepared. Maren stared at the terminal. Her whole life had trained her for moments when powerful people believed greed made her predictable. Her father had believed it. Investors had believed it. Rivals had believed it. She had often allowed them to believe it because it was useful. Tonight, Anika had made the same mistake. She thought Maren would protect the company because the company was all she loved. Maren looked at Junie, at the child's taped mouth and trembling shoulders, and thought of the blue bird drawing left on a restaurant table. Then she thought of Callum's hands rubbing warmth back into her fingers, his voice saying some people get lonely and call it strength. "There's a problem," Maren said. "No problem," Anika replied. "You speak. The system obeys. Not after biometric trauma. My bracelet detected removal and injury. It locks high-risk transfers unless a secondary live witness code is entered." Anika's eyes narrowed. "Convenient. It's compliance architecture. I designed it after an executive was kidnapped in Jakarta." That was true enough, though not in the way Anika assumed. The witness code must come from someone listed on the Secure Retreat Manifest. Your general counsel. Dead or unconscious. Pierce? Not executive tier. Maren let her gaze drift to the wounded mercenary, then back. The Helix chairman could do it. He is still at the lodge. Bring him here and I'll complete the transfer. No. Anika stepped closer. You're stalling. I'm saving you from an invalid transaction. If you force my voice without witness verification, the escrow keys burn. The patents go into federal receivership. You get nothing. Anika's face tightened with the fury of a woman hearing sense against her will. Below, through gaps in the floorboards, Maren saw Callum standing in the snow, hands slightly away from his sides, eyes raised not to Anika, but to the tower supports. Not pleading. Calculating. Maren kept talking. You wanted my company because you understand systems. Then understand this one. I can give you what you want, but not while you're pointing a gun at a child and rushing a lockout protocol. Anika's pistol shifted half an inch away from Junie as she leaned toward the terminal. Show me the lockout warning. Maren moved to the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She did not type her transfer code. She typed an internal emergency phrase, one never meant for ordinary use. Hostile coercion, live, location Iron Pine. The terminal blinked. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then it requested voice confirmation. Anika grabbed her hair and yanked her back. What did you enter? Maren swallowed pain. The lockout menu. It needs my voice. Say it. Maren looked at Junie. Maren Vale, Executive Authority 9, confirm hostile coercion. The terminal went dark. Anika stared. What did you do? A thin red light began blinking beneath the screen. Far away, buried in systems Maren had built to protect assets more carefully than people, emergency protocols awakened, recorded, transmitted, duplicated, and screamed. Anika struck Maren across the face with the pistol. Maren hit the wall hard and tasted blood again. Junie cried out behind the tape. Below, Callum moved. He did not run for the stairs. He threw himself at the nearest tower support and kicked loose the steel maintenance pin he had been studying since Maren began to stall. The old lookout, already weakened by ice and years of neglect, groaned. Anika spun toward the sound, dragging Junie with her. Stop! Callum seized a length of fallen cable half buried in snow, looped it around the second support, and pulled with his whole body. The tower shifted. The wounded mercenary lost balance and fired wild through the wall. Maren lunged, not at Anika, not at the gun, but at Junie. She wrapped both arms around the child and dropped, taking Junie's weight beneath her as Anika's pistol fired into the ceiling. Callum hit the third support with a loose iron step, breaking rotten wood. The whole lookout tilted sharply. Anika screamed, sliding across the floor. Maren held Junie against her chest as the cabin tore loose from one corner and slammed sideways into the branches of a hemlock. The impact shattered the window. Cold air and snow burst in. The mercenary fell through the broken door and disappeared down the stairs with a crash. Anika lost her pistol. It skidded beneath a crate. Maren tore the tape from Junie's mouth. "Go to your father," she said. "Crawl." Junie crawled through broken glass, sobbing. Callum came up the stairs 3 at a time despite the tower swaying under him. Anika reached the pistol first. She lifted it toward Junie's back. Maren saw the line of the barrel, saw Callum too far away, saw the child moving on scraped hands and knees, and something ancient and uncalculated rose in her. She threw herself across Annika's arm as the shot fired. Pain exploded along Maren's side, hot and unreal. Callum reached them a heartbeat later. He drove Anika into the wall with such force the old boards cracked, stripped the pistol from her grip, and pinned her with his forearm across her throat. For one terrible second, Maren thought he might kill her. Perhaps Anika thought so too. Her eyes bulged with fear. But Junie was crying, "Daddy! Daddy!" And Callum released the pressure just enough for Anika to breathe. He zip-tied her wrists with cable ties from his pocket, then crawled to Maren. "Where are you hit?" "I don't know," she gasped. "It feels impolite." A startled laugh broke through his panic and vanished. He pressed his hands to her side. They came away red. "Through and through, left flank. You're lucky. I have never felt less lucky. Stay with me." Junie crawled into Callum's side, shaking uncontrollably. He pulled her close with one arm while keeping pressure on Maren's wound with the other. The tower groaned again. "We have to get down." Maren looked at Junie, then at Callum's blood-smeared hands. "Take her first. I'm not leaving you." "You're a father," she whispered. "Do your job." His eyes filled with pain, and for a moment she saw the man beneath every discipline, every skill, every scar. Then he nodded once. "Junie, listen. Down the stairs. Slow, hold the rail. I'm right behind you." He lifted Maren as carefully as the broken space allowed and guided both of them down from the leaning tower into the storm. They made it only as far as the shelter of a rock wall before the first helicopter appeared over the ridge. Then another. Then 3 more. Their searchlights cutting through snow and trees, turning the night into a harsh, white dawn. State Police Tactical Units, National Guard Medevac, and Vale Aerodyne Emergency Response Teams converged on Iron Pine because Maren's coercion protocol had not merely called corporate security. It had transmitted evidence packets to federal authorities, defense auditors, and every board member with authority to freeze the deal. Anika Voss, bound and half-conscious, was taken into custody beside the ruined lookout, still shouting that Maren had destroyed billions in shareholder value as though that remained the highest crime available. Maren was placed on a stretcher, wrapped in thermal blankets, and lifted toward a medevac helicopter. She turned her head and saw Callum standing in the wash of rotor snow with Junie wrapped around him like a second coat. His face was bruised, blood marked one temple. His jacket hung open. He looked exhausted beyond speech, and yet when Junie pressed her face into his chest, his hand rose automatically to cover the back of her head from the wind. Maren lifted one trembling hand. Callum saw it. He came close enough that the medics complained and she could hear him over the blades. "Junie?" she asked. "Safe," he said. "Because of you." Maren tried to shake her head, but pain stopped her. "Because of you." He looked down, and the old humility in him returned, not weakness, but refusal to turn duty into performance. "Rest now." "Callum." He leaned closer. "I saw her," Maren whispered. "At the restaurant. I saw her little drawing and still chose not to see her." His expression softened. "You see her now?" Tears slid into Maren's hairline. "I see you now." The helicopter lifted before he could answer, carrying her into the gray edge of morning, while Iron Pine Reserve burned with emergency lights below. The weeks that followed did not restore Maren Vale to who she had been. They revealed how much of that woman had been armor and how little of it was necessary when the war was over. She spent 9 days in a hospital outside Pittsburgh, recovering from the gunshot wound and mild hypothermia, under federal protection and relentless media speculation. The official story broke in pieces: corporate sabotage, armed kidnapping, attempted theft of defense-related encryption assets, a rival CEO indicted under domestic terrorism statutes, private contractors arrested across 4 states. Anika's board disowned her before sunrise. Helix Meridian delayed the merger, then returned to the table under federal supervision. Vale Aerodyne's shares dipped, surged, and stabilized because markets were strange animals and sometimes mistook survival for strategy. Maren attended her first board meeting by video from a hospital chair, pale and bandaged beneath a navy cardigan Rosalind had brought because all of Maren's own clothes looked like costumes now. The directors expected fury, litigation, and a speech about resilience. Instead, Maren asked for a list of every executive security failure, every ignored maintenance warning, every contractor report dismissed because the person delivering it lacked title. Then she removed Pierce Danton's entire division, elevated 2 overlooked safety engineers who had flagged vulnerabilities months earlier, and created a new field advisory council requiring senior leadership to spend time with the people who built, repaired, transported, guarded, cleaned, and maintained the systems they sold. One director objected that such optics were unnecessary. Maren looked at him through the screen and said, "Optics are what almost got me killed. Competence saved me. Learn the difference." He resigned before the next meeting. Rosalind cried when she heard. Maren pretended not to notice, then held her aunt's hand until visiting hours ended. Callum did not visit during those first 9 days. He sent one text through Rosalind. "Junie is okay. Heal." That was all. Maren read it more times than she admitted. She later learned he had given federal statements, repaired the storm-damaged cottage roof at Iron Pine because the property manager was short-handed, and returned to Philadelphia in a borrowed truck with Junie asleep against his tool bag. He refused paid interviews. He refused a defense contractor's offer to consult on executive survival programs. When a cable network called him a secret commando carpenter, he unplugged his shop phone. Junie, according to Rosalind, had asked whether Miss Vale was still mean or just hurt. Callum had supposedly answered, "Sometimes people are both until they decide not to be." Maren deserved that. She kept Junie's question folded in her mind like a note. 3 weeks after Iron Pine, when she could walk without wincing and wear boots without assistance, Maren left her driver at the curb and entered Reed and Hollow Restoration, carrying a cardboard bakery box and a nervousness no hostile board had ever produced in her. The shop sat in a narrow brick building near an old rail line, between a welding supply store and a family-owned diner with fogged windows. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, coffee, machine oil, and sawdust warmed by sunlight. A radio played low behind the rasp of sandpaper. Callum stood at a workbench, guiding a plane along the edge of a walnut tabletop. His sleeves rolled, his scars visible, his movements patient and exact. Junie sat nearby, building a crooked house from scrap wood, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She saw Maren first and went still. Callum turned, and the plane stopped mid-stroke. "Miss Vale," he said, not coldly, not warmly, carefully. Maren set the bakery box on an open patch of bench. "Maren," she said, "please." Junie slid off her stool and moved closer to her father, but she did not hide behind him this time. Maren crouched slowly, though the wound in her side pulled. "Hello, Junie." The child studied her. "Are you still bleeding?" "Not anymore." "Daddy said you were brave." Maren swallowed. "Your daddy is generous." Junie considered that, then picked up a folded sheet of paper from her stool. "I made another bird," she said. "You can have this one if you want it." Maren took it with both hands. The bird was red this time, flying above a small wooden house. 3 people stood under it, a tall man, a little girl, and a woman with yellow hair that looked nothing like Maren's dark blonde bob, but somehow felt like forgiveness. "Thank you," Maren whispered. "I'll keep it safe." Callum watched, his face unreadable except for the softness around his eyes. Maren stood and faced him. For once, she did not reach for authority to steady herself. "I came to apologize without making it useful to me." Callum leaned one hip against the workbench. "That's a difficult kind." "I know." She looked down at his hands, then made herself continue. "At the Marlowe Club, I treated you as if your clothes, your work, and your daughter were evidence against you. I mistook polish for worth because it was easier than admitting how empty polish can be. You owed me nothing at Iron Pine, and you risked everything anyway. I am sorry for what I said. I am sorry Junie heard it. I am sorry it took terror for me to understand what decency looked like when it was sitting across from me." The shop was quiet. Outside, a train horn sounded faintly, long and lonely. Callum did not hurry to absolve her, and she respected him more for that. Junie opened the bakery box and whispered, "Cinnamon rolls." Callum glanced at her. "Bug." "What?" "I'm reporting." Maren almost laughed, then pressed her lips together. Callum finally said, "I accepted your apology on the mountain when you covered my daughter. You shouldn't have had to." "No." He folded his arms. "But people don't always become better in clean rooms. Sometimes it happens in the wreckage." Maren nodded. "Vale Aradine has established a scholarship trust for Junie. No conditions, no publicity. It belongs to her whether you ever speak to me again or not." His jaw tightened. "Maren, it is not payment. It is not gratitude disguised as control. Rosalind helped structure it through an independent trustee. You do not have to say thank you." He looked at Junie, who was pretending not to listen while getting icing on her fingers. "I'll read the documents." "You should." A small smile touched his mouth. "Good answer." Maren's courage nearly failed then, which surprised her because the next thing was simpler than federal testimony and somehow harder. "I also came to ask whether you and Junie would have dinner with me. Not at the Marlowe. There's a diner next door that smells like coffee and onions, and I have been told that is a more honest beginning." Junie brightened. "They have pie." Callum looked at his daughter, then at Maren's boots, which were plain brown leather and still too clean for the shop, but at least trying. "You hate diners." "I have never given diners a fair chance." "You hate surprises." "I am learning to survive them." He smiled then, not the polite smile from the restaurant and not the grim encouragement from the mountain, but something warmer, cautious, and real. "All right. Dinner. But Junie picks the pie. That seems wise?" Junie grabbed Maren's hand without warning, then looked embarrassed by her own boldness. Maren froze, not because she disliked it, but because the small trust of a child's fingers felt more valuable than any signature she had ever obtained. Carefully, she closed her hand around Junie's. Callum noticed. He looked away toward the window, giving the moment privacy. Months later, when people asked Maren why Vale Aradine changed so dramatically after the Iron Pine attack, she gave answers suitable for annual reports. Risk correction, ethical governance, operational humility, leadership accountability. Those things were true, but not complete. The complete answer lived in smaller places. It lived in a red bird drawing framed on the wall of her office, where visiting generals and investors sometimes glanced at it without understanding. It lived in a pair of brown boots under her desk beside the polished heels she still wore when the occasion required armor. It lived in Friday dinners at Reed and Hollow, where Junie taught her the rules of checkers with suspicious flexibility, and Callum poured coffee into chipped mugs, and no one cared what anything cost. It lived in the way Maren learned to listen when mechanics, drivers, assistants, guards, and technicians spoke, not as an act of charity, but because people closest to the work often stood closest to the truth. She did not become soft in the way tabloids liked to imagine. She still negotiated hard. She still fired liars. She still knew how to turn a room silent with one sentence. But the silence she valued changed. She no longer wanted the frightened silence of people afraid to be wrong around her. She wanted the deeper silence that came when truth entered and everyone recognized it. On a clear autumn evening, nearly a year after the storm, Vale Aerodyne opened a new emergency response training center funded jointly with federal agencies, dedicated to rescuers, field medics, and ordinary workers whose warnings too often went unheard. Callum attended only because Junie wanted to see the ribbon cut. He stood near the back in a clean flannel shirt, uncomfortable under attention, while Maren spoke from the small stage. She did not tell the crowd every detail of what he had done. He would have hated that. She simply said, "Some people build things that last because they understand what must hold when everything else fails. I owe my life to such a person. More importantly, I owe him the lesson that dignity does not announce itself. Sometimes it arrives with scarred hands, a quiet voice, and a child waiting to be taken home." The audience turned toward Callum. For once, no one laughed at his clothes. No one wondered why he belonged in the room. Executives, soldiers, engineers, and donors stood in a silence that was not pity and not embarrassment, but respect. Callum lowered his eyes, one hand resting on Junie's shoulder. Maren stepped down from the stage afterward and walked to them without hurry. Junie hugged her first. Callum looked at Maren over the child's head, and in his eyes she saw all of it. The ugly dinner, the frozen creek, the leaning tower, the apology, the slow rebuilding of trust from pieces no money could buy. "You did all right," he said. Maren smiled. "High praise from a diner person. Don't let it go to your head." "Too late." Junie groaned and pulled them toward the refreshment table. Callum followed, his hand brushing Maren's for one brief second before their fingers joined naturally, without announcement. No revenge had been taken. No grand victory needed to be shouted. The woman who once measured lives by balance sheets had learned to recognize the wealth of a steady heart, and the man she had dismissed had never needed her recognition to be worthy. That was why, when it finally came, it mattered. Truth had simply stood in the room, wearing work boots, and everyone had gone quiet enough to see it. Sometimes the richest lesson arrives in work boots. Callum Reed, once a para-rescue medic, now a widowed carpenter, never owned the polished world of executive suites, yet he saved CEO Maren Vale when her own fortress of power collapsed. When bullets shattered the glass and her title meant nothing, it was Callum's scarred hands, his quiet courage, and his fierce love for his daughter that pulled her through the storm. In that frozen night, Maren discovered a truth many of us overlook. Character is not measured by status, but by the dignity we show when no one is applauding. Humility listens, compassion moves, and real strength protects the vulnerable even after they have mocked you. So here's the challenge this story offers us. Look beyond appearances today. Give your respect to the bus driver who knows your name, the nurse changing night shift bandages, the parent juggling 3 jobs, because worth lives in actions, not resumes. And if you carry influence, use it to lift voices that don't sit at the boardroom table. Did this hit home for you? Tell me in the comments, whose quiet integrity has shaped your life? Your story might inspire someone else. And if you want more real-world tales that remind us what truly matters, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a lesson. Together, let's build a community that celebrates courage, kindness, and the unbreakable spirit of everyday heroes.